It's interesting that every human culture over all of human history has deduced that there is something beyond the physical world, some kind of spiritual dimension. It's not until recently that a group of human beings has posited that there is no transcendent reality. Atheist Ricky Gervais is one of these. He was on the Stephen Colbert Show a few years back, and Colbert asked him to explain his atheism. Gervais replied that there are about 3,000 deities that people have worshipped at one time or another. Christians don't believe in 2,999 of them. The atheist simply goes one God further. Gervais's exact words are, "I don't believe in just one more." The audience laughed and applauded, thinking that Gervais had scored some kind of a hit. But he didn't really. Just one more. That little word "just" is such a powerful word, and we should always use it very carefully. Gervais's use of the term "just" treats the rejection of a single God as an insignificant and logical necessity. This is far from the case. The step is neither logically necessary nor is it insignificant. It's a monumental leap of faith. His argument is that the rejection of this final God is the same as, and in line with, the rejection of all the preceding gods. But it isn't. The rejection of the last God is huge. To decide to drink only water is not as significant a step as ceasing to drink altogether. To wear only red pants is far less radical than wearing none. This step into atheism has been taken by very few, and these only recently. Of all the billions of people that have ever lived in all the remote corners of the world, nearly all of them have come to the same conclusion, that there is something more than matter. Rather than making a small step in line with the rejection of the first 2,999 gods, Gervais is making a giant leap in the opposite direction. He doesn't go one itty-bitty step beyond Christianity, as his "just" implies. He is breaking with the conclusion arrived at by the rest of humanity, a conclusion that has been arrived at independently over thousands and thousands of years of human history. That nearly all of humanity has arrived at the same conclusion isn't irrefutable proof that that conclusion is true. People who believe in any God certainly take a leap as well. But Gervais makes a significant leap of faith, and I think he would acknowledge it. We are talking about philosophical materialism, aka naturalism, or physicalism. The belief that reality is made up of only matter. It's only physical, it's only natural. There is no supernatural or spiritual reality that complements it. In the West, before the Enlightenment, God's existence was an indispensable part of the fabric of reality. People saw God as directing and maintaining the physical world through his providence. Planets moved and lambs were born by a direct involvement of God. Kings derived their authority to rule from God. My place in the world was a part of the cosmic order. Before the Enlightenment, good and evil were rooted in the moral law, and that was also a part of the created order. Birth and marriage and death were viewed with an eye turned toward heaven. The year and the month and the week were organized around the rhythms and patterns of the worship of God. After the Enlightenment, the idea began to spread that natural laws governed the physical universe. Governments had their authority by the will of the governed and created laws with the consent of the people. The individual can choose their place in society. I don't need to be a butcher just because my father was. Sunday is no different than Monday. Time is not shaped by recollections of divine action, but by a steady secular tick and talk. Before the Enlightenment, a reality without God was inconceivable. By the end of the 19th century, it was possible. When Friedrich Nietzsche said in The Gay Science in 1882 that God is dead, he meant just this, that it was now possible to conceive of a world without God. Many were exhilarated by the freedom gained by God's absence, something like a child experiences in the first 30 minutes after he runs away from home and the tyranny of his mother. He has his apple, his hunk of cheese, and his chocolate bar in his backpack. Nietzsche saw a few hours into the future when it started to rain and the food was gone. Nietzsche would not have been surprised by the events that plagued the West in the 20th century. He sort of predicted them. As materialism spread in our culture, we lost something. Our world became disenchanted. In chapter 4 of his book Orthodoxy, G.K. Chesterton explains the ethics of Elfland. I'll just give you a little snippet, but you should read the whole book. It's just great. Chesterton says that trees grow fruit, not because they are supposed to by the dictates of some natural law, but because they are magic. When we were children, we knew this to be true. When we were children, we didn't need fairy stories. We just needed stories. Because, Chesterton says, mere life is interesting enough. A child of 7 is excited by being told that Tommy opened a door and saw a dragon. But a child of 3 is excited by being told that Tommy opened a door. To a child, the world is enchanted. To our ancestors, our world was enchanted. But to us today, even believers, materialism has pressed the enchantment out of us. Some folks say that the Bible is nothing but a bunch of fairy tales. Chesterton would say that that designation makes it more truthful than an encyclopedia. Here's a quote. Fairy tales say that apples were golden only to refresh the forgotten moment when we found that they were green. Are green apples any less incredible than golden ones? Imagine what it would be like to walk through a grocery store with Chesterton's vision. We'd marvel at the piles of sweet, sour, red, yellow, green, and variegated orbs that grew on trees. They started as flowers and then magically turned pink petals into apples that you can eat raw or baked with brown sugar and cinnamon or smashed and have with pork chops. We'd be speechless as we saw the variety of edible roots, carrots and turnips and parsnips, and onions coming in yellow and white and purple. And then there's garlic and shallots and ginger. That any root tastes good is in itself a wonder, let alone so many. And don't get me started on the miracle of mushrooms that press out of the earth when the weather cools. If we had Chesterton's vision, if we saw the world as enchanted, we'd be so overwhelmed by the first few bins of the produce aisle alone that we'd probably break into spontaneous worship over the creator of all this. If you want another great example, look at John Piper's Enchanted explanation of rain. I'll put a link in the description. Sadly, materialism has disenchanted our world. Because we are not materialists, Christians should see the world a little differently, but we really don't. We've lived in the modern world all our lives, and our worldview is nearly as materialistic as our cultures. We believe in God and the spiritual realm, but for most of us, we struggle to see its influence in our ordinary lives. And materialist ideas have even gotten into the church. Let me ask you this. Where is God in your church service? If he's there, what's he doing? Is he listening? Scowling? Is he active or passive? I've got some videos coming up that will help us to see what God is doing in our Sunday services. But for now, let's just focus a bit. What happens during communion in your church? What do you do? We are instructed to remember. So that's one of the things we do. Besides remembering, I guess there's taking and eating. What's God doing in all this? It is my experience that God does a lot more in some churches than he does in others. The less God does, the more the human beings do. In materialist churches, communion is primarily a human act of remembering while eating and drinking. God is doing what? Looking on from above? This is really important because if God is passive in church, what's he doing during the week? Some people think that he's providing parking spots when we really need one, but that seems unlikely if he doesn't even have some part in the central part of Christian worship. What if God were the primary agent in communion? What if God were right there on Sunday morning, inviting us to the table, offering us bread and wine, moving within us to create a bond between him and between me and the rest of the people in the church, and between my church and all the churches all over the world? A bond that couldn't exist without his active involvement. That would be amazing. I don't agree with transubstantiation, but the Roman Catholics have something right. Their Eucharist is miraculous and it's mysterious. It's enchanted. Ours is too, but I think we've forgotten it. Let's look at the second Protestant sacrament, baptism. Some churches call the sacraments ordinances. instead of sacraments. Well, what's the difference? An ordinance is something that Christ ordained. It means it's something that he told us to do. Early Christians used the Greek word mysterion, which means some ordinary thing like water or bread and wine that was laced with the unseen presence of God. The word sacrament is a Latin term, and it is the means by which something is set apart. There seems to be some magic in these words. God is doing things, mysterious and wonderful things, in the ordinary stuff of life. So in baptism, who is the agent? Who is active, God or the baptized? For those who baptize adults, I hear a lot of language around deciding, showing, professing, taking the next step. That's what the human being is doing. But what about God? Infant baptism is all about God's active making promises in the ceremony. So God isn't so easily pushed off to the side. But paedo-baptists are not entirely off the hook here. Ask yourself, who is active in the infant baptism, God or the parents? I'm not necessarily talking about your church's published explanations of baptism. They can be okay, and you should read them and see what it says. See if God is thought to be doing anything. But even if God is very active in our explanations on our website, how are we talking about it in the baptism service, in church on Sunday? If we're not materialists, we will be using words describing God's actions. Words like calling, compelling, leading, cleansing, marking, admitting, comforting, protecting, reminding, setting apart. If we credit God with all this action, we might be left with little to do ourselves, except maybe obey. If materialism is wrong, and there is such a thing as the transcendent, and if God is active in the physical world and in our lives, then he certainly will be active in the sacraments. If you are intrigued by what you are hearing, consider subscribing to this channel. There's more of this kind of thing on its way. Thank you very much for watching.